What's up, and welcome to the Existential Stoic Podcast. Danny, I'm here with my buddy Randy.
Hey, Danny.
Hey, Randy. And today for episode 38, we are going to talk about perspective, long-term versus short-term thinking. Yeah.
This is a great topic because it covers so many different areas in life. Because, we're emotional creatures. You might say we think we're rational, but really we're emotional creatures. And oftentimes, we'll get pleasures in the short term that'll cost us in the long term and vice versa. And it's all over life. So I think this is a really great topic to cover today.
It is. And, it's funny. I was thinking about this topic a lot because I think, we've talked about a lot of times like planning and thinking ahead and trying to have not just like a weekly plan, but like a 10-year plan or even longer. Thinking in those terms is important. But at the same time, I was thinking about this too. And it came to my mind because there are also times where it seems like you need to favor the short term as well. And it's like knowing when or knowing which perspective you should be adopting is hard, very hard, I think. And it's like, I think we get stuck because, probably most of us tend to favor short-term thinking. We get distracted, right? Pleasures. We're interested in like feeling comfortable now, not really thinking about the work that needs to be put in and stuff. And that is detrimental. At the same time, though, I think just long-term thinking can also be kind of problematic. It's always a balance, it seems like.
Yeah. Because it is, like if you think too long-term, you're never going to really enjoy right now.
Yeah, that's like is that the problem of like being present in the now versus like always, because if you're always looking ahead, you're never right in the now, right? You're never experiencing this moment. So I guess that's what I thought we should talk about today is how do we find this balance? How do we work with both these perspectives, which I think have some value, and we can talk about that, but also how should we incorporate them into our lives so that we have the right perspective on, the right issue or whatever, or the right problem.
Was there something that kind of brought this up this week for you?
Yeah. So, this week I was thinking about like lots of just stuff this week, like normal, and I had, at the beginning of the week, I was a little bit down. I had like a couple bad days, and I was thinking about some of the stuff I'm working on. And I was trying to remind myself at the time to be positive. I was trying to remind myself, look, I need to stick this out. I just need to keep going because really what I'm looking for is not change tomorrow, but change over the year and over the next 5 years. And then I started thinking about this issue because I was like, it's funny that can be so helpful sometimes because like in this situation I was in, it helped because, it made me realize that, even though I didn't love the thing I was working on right now, the value of it made sense because the skills and everything else that I was gaining would work long term. So that was a kind of situation of being sort of like dealing with the short term, struggle to get the long term benefit. But I was just thinking about it because I find myself doing this a lot, and it's like not always clear, I think, which perspective works best or should be taken in a situation. Because on the other flip side, I guess this is where it came up. I also had a really good few days as well, and I was really focused on the now, being present. I was trying to be more present, and that's very short-term thinking. So it's like this weird use of perspective to adjust, how you see the world, right?
I think that you can be present while still pursuing the long game. So one of my favorite examples is Gary Vaynerchuk has a couple of videos where he talks about perspective all the time. He thinks that everyone's trying to judge themselves way too early. He thinks the biggest problem for most people right now is they think they messed up and now they're behind. When the reality of the situation is, for most people in the world, I would say for most people listening to this podcast, because we have electricity, podcasts, ability, internet.
Hopefully,
we're in the top tier of the world, and so having the perspective that we're living better than a lot of people, and if you're lacking that perspective, there's a really good book called Factfulness where he really puts it into perspective. Into if you have a bed, if you have running water, something to heat up food, and electricity, you're doing better than pretty much all of the world.
Oh yeah, you are.
Yeah, and so we miss this completely, and so we're so short-term focused in the feeling it now, I need to do it now, it needs to happen right now, that we completely miss out on the entire opportunity of our lives. Like we're living longer than ever nowadays. And if you think by your 20s or your 30s or your 40s, you're supposed to achieve something, you're missing the majority of your life.
Not only the majority of life, but the majority of your life where you probably have a better sense of self. You probably have a better perspective on what you actually want, what's right for you. I mean, these things make it easier to accomplish. And you have a lot of skills built up, right? I'm glad you brought up that up too, because I think that's part of it, right? Is that feeling that, you're a certain amount of time through life and feeling like you've wasted time and stuff. That's something I've always struggled with, right? It's hard. And knowing you have a lot of time left, sometimes in the moment isn't really helpful always, because you're like, well, and I think, I wonder too, because I think sometimes when we focus on that, like, I wasted all this time, and I want it right now, and it's not going to happen now. It's also an excuse to not blame ourselves, or to not do anything to improve. I think that is true. Like sometimes it's like comfort in a shitty situation and therefore staying in it, right? Because you're familiar with it rather than pursuing something different.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We certainly can get stuck in it in that way.
And I don't know, the short term is rough too, because I think that's where we find most of us struggle too, with like anxiety, the existential despair. It tends to come from short term thinking, feeling like you've wasted time, and wanting change now, looking around you and being bombarded with all these examples of apparent wild success overnight. And I think that it's a mess.
Yeah. So what I wanted to share was I've experienced this like very vividly, where I went to school. Like I basically pursued a life that I was being a good son. I went and got a real profession. I got engaged. I did all this stuff, and I ended up miserable and $250,000 in debt.
But you were a good son.
Yeah, exactly. So pat on my back for that one. But it was kind of like at that point realizing I was in that spot where I was like, I've made a huge mistake. Like Job from Arrested Development.
Yeah. I just think
I never said I made it. I never admitted to making a huge mistake. Yeah. But basically I was like, I've made a huge mistake. And so it was really perspective that allowed me to get out of that, because I was like, okay, I've dug myself a hole. If I have 6 months left to live, what makes my life worthwhile? Is it going to be just going to work and doing this job that I don't enjoy and doing whatever? Or is it going to be putting in a full work week and then coming home and trying all these different things to try and find something that gains some traction so I can get out of this, so I can go pursue the life that I love? And so it's that perspective that it was somewhat, it's funny because it's like that almost collapsed the long-term perspective. Because the long-term perspective, we think on my deathbed, what will I think of my life? But with that, it's like, if I have 6 months left to live, all of a sudden your long-term perspective is 6 months. And then it makes it a lot more real, because you can't say, I'll do that someday. You have to say, I'll do that now. I have to do that now.
Yeah. That's the difficulty when we talk in terms of like a decade, even 5 years, I think, even a year sometimes. I think it's easy to put things off, because it seems like you have so much time that you feel like, well, I can do it later. I can do this whenever. And so that can also be a hindrance to starting action. Because I like what you said, that's an important point what you said there. Like you found yourself in a situation where you were like, oh shit, like you have all this debt. You basically were doing something for the wrong reasons your whole life. So, and I found myself in a similar situation, right? Where it's like you wake up one day and you realize you're like, oh shit, like, now I need to actually figure this out. And I think it's funny because when we stay focused on the short term, we end up not changing anything. And that's negative, because you just end up staying in a situation where you're unhappy. But to make those changes is always difficult. And you need to start thinking like, all right, so what can I do now? And I like that the 6 month is workable. You can at least say, okay, well, I can do these things immediately. So no matter what, in 6 months, at least I'll have, exercised agency and something will have improved, right? You might not solve all your problems, but at least you've improved something. You're doing what you want.
But it's like, it's a time period where it's realistic, because 6 months, like you've been through 6 months a bunch of times. But like if you're thinking like, oh, I have 40 years, then you're like, whatever. But yeah. Um,
I
so
think,
yeah,
yeah, I
like,
think a lot of times the long-term perspective is helpful, especially when you're thinking about like your development. Like if I'm learning something or I'm trying to, use the example of Steve Martin all the time with the banjo, right? Like, if I have 40 years, I can be an expert in anything. I think that perspective is wildly helpful when we're like learning things or doing projects. So we realize that like we don't have to have it completed now. It doesn't have to be perfect now. Because that thinking, I think, screws us up.
hmm.
But it's also
Yeah,
hard to plan that way, I think, sometimes. When you're
yeah.
just setting goals long term with no idea of how to get them right. It's like careful planning is required.
Hmm. And also, doing things. I think so often we want short-term results, and it's almost it's pretty much only bad things that give you short-term results.
Yeah,
you know, like
yeah, it is.
addictive substances or social media or fast food. All these things, they give us short-term results, but really the things that will make a difference in our lives, they take a little bit longer. And so it's kind of just putting in the work, having the short-term mindset that I'm just going to do it today, and I'm just going to do it today, and I'm just going to do it today. And then you just keep on doing it today and today and today, and you build up momentum, and then you really start charging forward, because that's when you start making some changes.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That's like usually like it's like a few months down the road after you start that you really start seeing progress because all of a sudden you've more or less built in routines, right? Things that you're doing all the time. And I think that's part of the long-term thinking is also thinking in terms of like, what routines can I develop? What things am I going to do every day? What types of things can I build on slowly over time that will pay like way more later, even though I might not see that progress now. But I think
Yeah.
this is the struggle we face because we all feel this like almost like urgency or need for the immediate right satisfaction that weighs on us. And then, like I said too, I think we're bombarded with examples, especially if you're on social media and shit, of this apparent success very quickly, or these individuals who have already done all the stuff, and
Well,
we're not
it's
looking at
it's
everything else.
it's only apparent success
Yeah,
quickly. So like anyone who is an actual success, they all know it's a compounding thing. Like
yeah,
Warren Buffett, he's as good as he is with money because he's been doing it for so long and he's so well known in that area that anytime somebody has a deal, they're going to come to him for it. So it's like
yeah.
the long term staying. It's all a long term game. Naval Ravikant says it. Gary Vaynerchuk says it. They all say it's a long term game. Like you keep trying to do your short term quick fixes, get rich quick. Meanwhile, they're going to be playing the long term game, and in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, that's going to be paying off where you're still going to be chasing this quick fix.
Well, and that's the problem too, I think, is people, when people look at those examples like, oh, they have it so easy and stuff, they forget that they've built relationships, they've built a reputation, they've developed all these skills, so they know how to do things quickly and efficiently, and they know what to delegate out. I mean, I think we forget often too when we're trying to get these quick gains in the immediate now, we forget all the stuff that you gain from doing something over a long period of time, right? All those things that just make it easier. It's like anything. If you've been in a job for more than a year, you realize it gets easier because you just got better at it. You know what you're doing. You're more confident, and it's just an easier thing to do. And I think that sort of thinking helps with the long term too, is the idea that, if I just keep at it, it will get easier, it will get better, and I'll become more skilled
Mhm.
over time,
Yeah.
slowly.
Yeah. I would definitely say that, at least personally, my viewpoint of it is you always have to favor the long term over the short term. Even though, and, granted, I give myself some short term things as well. But for the most part, most of the stuff I try and do is long term oriented, because it's hard. Like every day when I wake up and I work out, even though I don't feel like it, even though I'm tired and my body aches, I do it because I know that long term it's going to pay off. Even though today it would be a lot more fun to just lay in bed. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like budgeting. I don't even know how long I've been doing it, for over a year now, where I just write down every single penny that I spend. And it's not easy, because every time I go, buy something to eat or have a drink at Starbucks, or buy some clothing or anything, any expense, I need to write it down. And it's not hard, but it's inconvenient. And that inconvenience really keeps me on top of where my money's going. And that's allowed me to really budget and tell my money where I want it to go.
Yeah, it's funny
So
about that. Well, I mean, I think in those situations, like with the writing down, what you're spending, it's like I think that the hard part for a lot of people is you really have to force yourself to do it at first. It's like because you're gonna forget, or you're gonna be like you're gonna want to put it off, or be like, I'll do it. And then once you do that, it's like the whole thing falls apart. So you have to like, and it's same with exercise, right? You have to like force yourself to do it every day. But there is a point where that doesn't become, that's no longer, you don't have to force yourself anymore. Because once you get the routine down, it's like, okay, now I don't want to miss this. I don't want to not do this, even though maybe it is inconvenient, or even though it does take time. It becomes a lot easier in that respect. But I think most people struggle with that initial point, right, of forcing yourself.
yeah. And like two things I can say that's helpful with that is one, whenever I don't want to do it, I tell myself tomorrow. I can put off doing it. Because
Like that.
oftentimes by tomorrow I'm okay doing it anyways. It's just today I didn't feel like doing it. So I always tell myself tomorrow. And then if I do miss it, because we're human,
Yeah.
we're emotional, we make mistakes, we fall off the bandwagon. Just don't do it twice in a row. So what? I miss a workout. Guess what? Next day I'm back.
No, it's a good attitude too, because you're less hard on yourself, right? I think that's one of the other things we struggle with is we beat ourselves up, and then it's all these things that really pull us down to just our old routine rather than developing something new or better. And I think that makes it so difficult. I think too with like the trying to incorporate something new and forcing yourself to do it. I think sometimes to just there's nothing better than just doing it, just forcing it, making it happen, even if it's uncomfortable and difficult, because it does get better over time. And I think keeping that perspective in mind is not always easy, but it's helpful to remind yourself that all these things are routine.
So okay, so we're talking about how like all these things that we want to change about ourselves, and oftentimes it's really we just want like a change of state. Like we want something,
Yeah.
and I forget this all the time because I have all these things that I want to do, and I think because when I get there, when I'm doing that, then I'll be feeling great. And really, all I
Yeah.
want is the feeling great. I don't want to do all the
We
extra
all want
work
that.
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of that saying, like all a man's problems come from his inability to sit still and do nothing.
Oh
And
God, yeah.
yeah. And so, with having a short term and a long term perspective, potentially just being able to sit with where we are and maybe not grasping as much for something other than where we are is a short term way to actually get what we want.
Yeah, actually letting ourselves sort of calm down in the moment, not worrying, not stressing, and giving ourselves time to actually think about things right in the moment and enjoy the time that we have. Yeah, I think that's important. It's crucial. It is hard. I think like, it's funny because you see everyone literally struggle with these two things. I mean, especially with the having the right perspective, the long-term perspective for things that matter is very difficult, I think, for a lot of people. Um, I don't know. It's funny. I think, one thing that's always helped is like, setting yourself like I think you had called it waypoints before, but that was really useful. I use that method, right? So setting yourself like, in 6 months, if I keep doing this, I'll give myself this prize, right? So setting yourself like some reward for sticking with it. It helps you focus on a more realistic amount of time, whether it's a month or 3 months. And it keeps you sort of going and keeps you motivated, which is helpful because we are goal oriented. That's the other problem. We do function under a sort of, we're always pursuing some end. The problem is a lot of times we pursue easy, quick ends that usually aren't helpful or aren't going to benefit us in any way moving forward, right? And I think that's one of our biggest things that we struggle with. What was it? I think it was Aristotle that said, with virtue, right? It's like, it's about feeling pleasure and pain for the right things at the right time. So training yourself to feel the right, that it's, that the type of work you're doing is a good thing because you get all these benefits from it, right? And feeling pleasure that you're accomplishing something or whatever, rather than just like binge watching Netflix or whatever the fuck for 8 hours and wasting a shitload of time.
Yeah, that's what you said right there with that quote. That's pretty much it because you have to use pleasure and pain to sculpt yourself into what you want to become. Like I remember I read a few Tony Robbins books back in the day, and he would always talk about getting rid of bad habits. And he would do that by associating so much pain with them, like the pain of what happens later on in life from continuing this habit. Instead of it being out there somewhere, he brings it really in close, very physical, very tangible, and then helps associate that with whatever bad habit that's giving you pleasure now, but the payoff is not exactly there.
Isn't that funny? Because we don't have, the future is far off and unknown in the sense that it's not happening now. So we tend to just ignore a bunch of stuff that we more or less know with good reason that it will likely come about, right? Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I might not make it to that age, but we also know the things you're doing now, those consequences are still going to happen, right? They're still going to have a negative impact. And I think that's, sometimes the long-term perspective can be helpful in addressing that because you kind of are thinking more about like, okay, in 20 years when I'm 60 or 50 or whatever, right? What will then, my situation be like? What do I want? What am I aiming for? And then you start to think, well, what am I doing now that's going to hinder that or get in the way moving forward? And I think that does help you sort of think better in that respect, with the things that we're like kind of usually pushing off or just ignoring or denying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that one thing that's really important is kind of coming to grasp with where we are right now. So like a lot of us, a lot of us have
Right.
habits that are, you know, short-term payoffs for long-term costs. And, also we have to recognize the things where we're giving up stuff now so that we can have a payoff later and really sit down and evaluate that because I know personally that's something that I don't really do consciously.
What do you have in mind, like with the? Can you have an example of that?
Yeah. So like for instance, I'll say like eating. Oftentimes I will put off eating what I want now so that I can have healthier stuff later. So that's like an example of a good one. And then an example of a bad one would be like I don't know.
Hard to
I'll have
think.
to I'll have to evaluate this.
Well, it's funny because a lot of it's about self-control, right, and planning. I mean, it's like I'll use an example because I did this the other night, but like going out to the bar, right, and having too many drinks, not stopping yourself, not having sort of a sense of what the right amount is or what's a good amount for the situation, and then paying for that the next day with feeling terrible, or any short-term things we do like that have these consequences. Ultimately, just too, they make life harder later. And we talked about this before, right? Doing the easy thing now usually leads to pain and difficult consequences later.
Hmm. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess the what would be important for people who are really questioning the short term, like let's say somebody does, for instance,
One
for a
last
long
thing.
time in my life. Yeah.
Go ahead. You
I'll
talk.
just
I'm with
I'll just talk with myself. For a long time in my life, I smoked cigarettes. And so that was a short-term benefit, but there was a definite long-term cost because even though it's not guaranteed you're going to have lung cancer if you smoke cigarettes, it's you're much more likely to develop lung cancer if you smoke cigarettes, not to mention coughing all the time, uh, having decreased physical activity levels. So all that stuff, there was the cost and the benefit analysis. And so like for a long time in my life, the the immediate benefit far outweighed the cost. Okay. And I think sometimes I talk about this every once in a while, how sometimes you have to get to the breaking point. Like there's no other
you.
way around it. Like I said the same thing about people who want the instant, like people who want the money and the cars and the watches and the trophy spouse and all this stuff. Like you have to get it and then realize that's not it. Or maybe that is
Yeah.
it for you. But like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's the problem of like we have to learn the lesson ourselves, right? Usually to really have
yeah,
it sink in. And that's
yeah.
that's always the bitch of it.
Yeah. So for me, smoking cigarettes, like I smoked cigarettes for a long time. I tried quitting a whole bunch of different ways, but then it got to a point where it was just like, I couldn't run playing soccer anymore. I was coughing all the time. Like I had to have one first thing in the morning or last thing before I went to sleep. And it was just like, this is ridiculous. Like, I don't even have my life anymore. And so, I think that's oftentimes you need to get to that breaking point to be able to separate the
It's
short term from the long
I
term.
like that example too, because it's also like our habits can be a way to define ourselves or they control us, right? And it's like when we choose habits because of short-term gains, and we're not really making an active choice because the short-term gains what's causing the choice, right? We're being controlled by them. When we're making choices to become something, we're defining ourselves, we're cultivating ourselves, right? We're taking control. And I think that's a great example, right? The smoking is a great example where, when you really look at it, you're wasting a ton of time. It's like,
A lot of
why are you,
money.
yeah, a lot of money, obviously, right? And most things are like that, but, we don't realize it in the short term. It's funny, people think like, even something as simple seeming as like going on social media or like TV, right? You waste all this time, but that time is valuable because, all of your time that you spend doing these things, like it might seem fun at the moment or relaxing, but you're not doing stuff that's going to help you either long term. So you're really like, it's like you're the more you do that, the more it's like you're weighing yourself down, your future self down with these burdens of you didn't do things at the time that would have helped you and made things easier, right? And that's why it's like choosing the difficult thing in the moment. It seems difficult, but in reality, it's actually the right thing because it makes life so much easier later on. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, how would an existentialist and a stoic look at this? Being the existentialist stoic podcast where all these people are
Right.
subscribing
I
right
know.
now
And we need
and
to have
liking
that.
and
We need to have
sharing and
that
everything.
lens. um, yeah, it's interesting because I think it's funny. The perspective issue is always one that I've thought about a lot with respect to this, because I think, the existentials with the emphasis on authenticity, obviously, I think there is that sense in which, they take a very interesting perspective because you have that meaninglessness of life, the arbitrariness of it all.
I mean, we
And I
think
think,
of
but
the typical existentialists are sitting in a French cafe, like, oh,
yeah,
what is this life? This is the
chain smoking
bullshit.
cigarettes and drinking
Yeah.
coffee and having lots of sex.
Yeah.
So arguably, yeah, it's funny, right? Yeah, but I think so. I think with authenticity, right, you have to take sort of a wider perspective, I would say, because you have to look at yourself and look at the way you're letting externals dictate who you are. Like your situation, when you said, like when you were younger, you were trying to be the good son, right? So some external idea or concept was really was really dictating how your life played out, the choices you were making, but they weren't your own, right? They weren't coming from within you, something that you self-identified with. It was something like sort of imposed on you. So that's like the conforming thing, right? And that happens to us in so many ways. And I think that like a wide or broad perspective can help us see that. And then if we can see that, if we see how we're being sort of pushed and pulled in different ways, that's when we can start asserting our own agency and choice to be authentic, which I think does involve, no matter how you shake it, it involves long-term thinking, because you're asking yourself, who do I want to become? What do I need to do now to become that person? And that could be as simple as, like recognizing that, you've been doing things for the wrong reasons. You've been trying to be a good son, not live the life that you want. And so how do I start making those changes? What do I need to do? And a lot of times that might just be, starting to make choices on your own now and starting to plan and then working through the problems that you have, right? To get to that point. And I think, so there is definitely like a long-term thinking, but also a broad perspective, I think, with, looking at our lives.
Yeah. I like that word authenticity because it kind of allows you to see your negative habits at the moment. Because when
Yeah.
you're eating that bag of chips at 1 o'clock in the morning, you realize that you're actually selling short your authentic self. Like you're sabotaging yourself at that moment. It's not this like oh, I really want it right now. It's like you're actually sabotaging yourself.
Yeah, right. And you get to see too, like when you think that way, you really do, it does shine a light on like, what am I allowing to define me that shouldn't be? And I think so many of us, that's, it happens. I mean, I know so many people who were so angry all the time because they were watching the news too much and on social media too much. And then after January, they stopped for a little while, and it's like their stress levels and attitudes just dramatically changed, right? And it's like if you don't see the connection in the relationship, you're letting yourself be like worked up, stressed out, and basically you're letting yourself be led around by someone else, right? By that, I mean, because that's what they want. They want you freaked out, so you watch, right, all the time,
Dude, and I
and they
don't
want
even
people angry.
understand where this idea came from that you need to watch the news to like. I don't understand where this idea is that you need to be in touch with everything happening all over the world all the time. It's like, why? I haven't watched the news in probably like 12 or 15 years and I'm doing just fine. If
That's another,
if
yeah.
anything serious happens, somebody tells me.
Well, it's funny because it's like that idea of like, being an informed citizen back 40 years ago, that meant you were up to date on like a few national issues that they talked about in the papers, or, they might have had on a 30-minute program. You had the
Yeah.
basic
There was
idea.
one newspaper a day, maybe.
Yeah.
Like
You didn't
depending
have
on where you live.
24/7 analysis like
Yeah.
all the time. And it's like, I think that like that mentality too with social media, I have to be up to date with everything. It's like, it's impossible. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like just this ongoing stream of data. So I think, yeah, I think it's, having this perspective, being able to see ourselves and see what's happening, because we start to see what's happening to us rather than because of us. And I think that's like an important distinction to make for perspective, right? Because I think short-term perspective can be really good, or, having that short-term sort of mindset can be really helpful when we choose it for the right reasons. Like if I want to be in the moment because I'm doing something really fun, or I'm taking a vacation, I don't want to worry about anything else. I give myself a break. I plan it, right? It's my choice, and I just enjoy my time. That's different from, trying to just like, distract yourself or get the immediate pleasure and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Stoics, how would they look at it?
Stoicism is interesting too, because you got with the notion of like a flourishing life, right? The idea of eudaimonia, like a successful, flourishing life. It really has to do with, virtue ethics really has to do with like self-perfection, right? So cultivating, really essentially crafting the self, perfecting yourself through by essentially like realizing the virtues, right? Or realizing those within yourself. So I think for them too, it's like, making those hard decisions because you're making careful, conscious decisions about what's right in the moment. So what is the right type of action? What kind of character traits are you trying to cultivate? What is the mean for you with respect to something? So what is the virtuous state look like? Having a sense of that, I think, kind of accounts for both short and long term, because having a sense of what the virtuous state looks like is a long-term thing, right? It's an idea of what you're aiming for, essentially. And that would, be also working towards the flourishing life. On the other hand, knowing how to act in the moment is short term, right? It's understanding the actual complexities of the situation and being able to choose the right thing. But I think in both cases, it's funny because whether you take a stoic or existential perspective on this, it's also about being more self-aware, right? Because I think a lot of times, and maybe that is the problem. Maybe a lot of times what we struggle with a short and long perspective is we're not really self-aware, we're distracted. And if we were self-aware, it wouldn't actually be that big of a problem or that big of a deal, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of distraction. I mean, it's hard. There's so much going on. But I did want to touch on a couple things you said with the Stoic point of view that really stuck out to me. So one was the cultivation part of it, and the other was kind of trying to find strike the mean in the virtue. So the first with the cultivation part, it makes me think of like planting stuff for the seasons. Like as hard as when they're planting in the fall or in the spring, as hard as they plant, it's not going to come up until harvest in the next fall. So
yeah,
it's kind of like it gives you somewhat of a longer perspective in your life that like no matter how hard you work at this right now, you could go 20 hours a day. You could take all types of drugs so you could stay up and work your heart out and put everything else to the side. But it's still going to take time to cultivate and to actually grow and develop. So
I like that you said that. No, it's a good point, right? The idea that like you're putting in sort of these little things now for that longer term sort of growth that's going to occur, but it's going to take time. And I like what you said there too about like trying to force it now. like taking drugs or something, trying to stay up, trying to force yourself to be awake and just work, work, work. It's like you're just missing out on things now and you're not going to get it done any faster. And it's probably going to be worse because you're rushing through it rather than letting it happen in the natural way. And I think that
Mhm.
that's a great point.
Yeah. And then also what you mentioned with kind of finding the mean between virtue, but also between like short-term and long-term thinking, meaning that it's not long-term. It's not like all the way at the very end, and it's not right now, but it's somewhere a mix of the middle, depending upon the situation, depending upon the person. And that's a very helpful thing because like I find myself like I'm very strict with myself often, and I notice that that's oftentimes it helps me out in a lot of ways, but it's also somewhat of a character flaw. And so like I realize that sometimes I have to be more gentle with myself to give myself some of these short-term benefits or short-term pleasures, because otherwise I'm just going to burn myself out.
Yeah, isn't it funny how like a lot of things that like we have that are very positive are also detrimental at the same time? Because it's like because it's not like anything's universal. Being strict with yourself can be really great if you're trying to exercise, do a budget and stuff, but it's not going to be helpful for everything. And I think that's the difficulty, right? Is that like no matter what it is, it's like that middle path, finding that midway or that the right application, that is the hard part. That's the practical wisdom, right? That's where that comes in. And I think, it's funny because we see these traits that like, for instance, we idolize someone who's really wealthy or something. And like we look at their traits and we're like, oh, they're like, they work 80 hours a week or something. It's like, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you can't apply that mindset to everything though. It doesn't work. You have to think, and find out what it works for, what it's beneficial for, where it gets you on the right path, and where it's going to be a hindrance and stay away from it. And that is always hard. Like you said, you have to remind yourself to be gentle. It's like, that strictness stays with you. So it's like you have to actually temper it and keep it in check as you go. And it's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just coming back to what you said about we're distracted.
Yeah.
Attention is one of the scarcest resources nowadays. And we're so distracted that we're spending time living lives basically for these other people, trying to impress
Yeah.
people we don't like, uh, addicted to these systems that a couple of people developed. And so in essence it's trying to find your attention again so that you can
Yeah.
turn that attention towards the conscious development of yourself.
Well, I think the worst part too with those, with like the social media and with stuff like that, and with worrying about other people's opinions is you never stop to ask yourself why it really matters to you, right? Why what you're doing really is important. It's like when we're distracted like that, we tend to lose, I think, we tend to associate others' values as our own rather than actually accepting those values as our own. And I think that's one of the problems and one of the sort of flaws we sort of, or one of the sort of flaw things we do, I guess, because it's like you end up just sort of getting more and more distracted over time and just losing it, right? You lose everything in that sense, which is terrible. It's amazing too. Every time I read something about, even self-reporting, how much people report they're on their phones or watching TV or doing these things a day, it's like, it's insane. I think the average is something like 4 to 5 hours reported on phone and on TV. That's like 10 hours a day. That's crazy. I don't know how long people are up a day, but if you're sleeping like 6 or 7 hours at least, that's like most of your day.
Mm-hmm.
It's nuts. And I think that's something people can do too. I think that's a helpful thing is, just track, don't judge yourself, but just track your time, how you spend your time every day for like 2 weeks, and then look at it. And I know you'll find places you can easily make room for doing other things. It's like, that's always a good method because
Mm-hmm.
we do waste a lot of time when we're not focused or we don't have routine or plan. We're not thinking of that longer term impact. And, that's an easy way to sort of just waste time all day.
Yeah. Yeah. Zig Ziglar used to always talk about that. Television was his favorite whipping boy for, where if you don't have any time, take some time out of TV. And this was obviously before social media, but yeah.
Oh
And
yeah,
it's
people
just,
used to spend a lot of time watching TV, like way more time, I think, even watching TV back then, because that's all there was as that major
Mhm.
distraction, right?
Oh, and
Yeah,
here's another thing. So we have these addictions like social media, like TV. We can also use them to create new habits. So, like, let's say we're addicted to social media and television and whatever it is. harness the power of that addiction, say, and to actually do something that you want to do. Like, let's say you want to get in shape, but you end up spending 4 hours a day on social media. Say, okay, awesome. I realize I'm addicted. I'm going to do one push-up before I go on Facebook every day. And then, you can start to build that up over time, but you're going to develop the exercise habit and harness the power of your addiction in order to do that. So, it's not bad in and of itself that we like to go on social media or we like to watch television, but it's like that's already a firmly rooted habit in your brain. So you can actually use that to initiate a new habit for your positive development.
Oh, I like that, like pairing. So you could even do like, okay, if I'm on social media or I'm on YouTube or whatever for say like 3 hours a day, I'll do 15 minutes, I'll do an exercise video, right? At least then you're doing it, you're incorporating it. Yeah, it's a great idea. I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I heard about this guy who hooked up an exercise bike to his television with Netflix, that he needed to be cycling at a certain speed in order for Netflix to play, or else it would pause.
That's awesome.
And that's how he turned his binge watching into exercise.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
I wonder what speed he had it set at. Yeah, it's hard over a long period of time. That's funny. That's awesome. That's a good idea, though, right? You're trying to pair these things that become better, right, over time. So you have that long-term thing. At least you're trying to start doing it. And then once you start doing it, I think it gets a lot better. All right. Did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think the main thing, my main takeaway from this would be always favor, or at least this is a personal opinion, and opinions taken with a grain of salt. But my personal opinion is always favor the long-term habits. You're going to get a much greater payoff if you favor the long term over the short term. That's my opinion.
No, I think there is some truth to that, right? Especially when we're talking about, living a good life, there has to be some planning, there has to be development, and development takes time. Any sort of skill set, anything we do that's going to have more value, that we're going to feel better about, that's going to increase our self-worth, is going to be something that we put work into, right? And I think so that means over a longer period of time, but also realizing that you're not going to be perfect immediately, that these things aren't going to just all of a sudden pay off, but that you have to put time into it first. And when you do that, I think you do see, I think that perspective is important, because you see those gains later and things get easier and you can do more, right? As they get easier and as you get better at it.
And it's the compounding effect. Like, there's a really good book, I think, called The Compound Effect. But there's like the long tail where you're doing a whole bunch of stuff and nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden, all the way at the end, boom, that's when it really goes up. So it's that long-term benefit that you can really gain from.
I think a takeaway too for me is also, like, when you're struggling with these things, it's important to take different perspectives, right, on the issue. And I think that's the issue with perspective, right? So if you find yourself struggling, if you find yourself, right, like, depressed, or you feel like you're like just spinning your wheels, take a step back, try to look at it from different ways, short term and long term, to kind of figure out where you're going wrong or what's wrong for you, what's working for you, what's not working, and then you can kind of get back into the right thing, right?
Yeah. And I like what you said there, kind of taking a step back, because that's something that I noticed works really, really well for me. Whenever I'm overwhelmed or just feeling rather bad, I will list out on paper everything in life that I'm up to, like all the things that I'm working on and doing, because you don't think it's that much, but then you write it down and it's a list of like 80 things. And it's like, no wonder I'm not getting anywhere, because my focus is so split on all these different things. And then you can actually prioritize that and figure out where you want to go.
Well, and that's a lot of it too, right? It's just taking more proactive steps, right? Being more in control rather than being controlled by other things. I think that's a huge part of it. And it's a good point too. If we get involved in too much shit, we can't do anything really. You just make such slow progress that you really get nothing done. I like that. All right. I think that's good, right? Yeah. All right. So that was episode 38. I can't believe it, man. Perspective, the long-term versus the short-term. Yeah. So, if you guys, I hope you guys liked the episode. If you're liking this, check us out on YouTube. If you're listening, as a podcast, if you're listening to us, check us out, watch the video on YouTube. You can get us wherever podcasts are available. We will be back midweek with another quick fix. Those are short, less than 10-minute episodes. Please, guys, share, subscribe, click notifications. It helps us out a lot. Until midweek, though, Danny.
I'm Randy. Later, Danny.
Later.